Thank you, Bernie. Data. Well, I have two pieces. One of the ground rules here is to show the audience a piece of data, a datum that can help lead us into the technosphere. I have two pieces of data, and so we know what we're talking about with regard to the technosphere. Let me give my version of it. This little cartoon, it includes the people in the world and the technological artifacts in the world and the kind of the links between them. And so I'd like to share with you this datum. This is it. This is a €1 coin. It's a piece of the technosphere. It's a technological artifact. It's you can see it right there. That's it. It's also a part of the Earth. It's made of the metals copper and zinc and nickel, I think. And those metals come from the Earth, and the euro also belongs to the Earth, and one could say it's also a geological euro as well as a technological euro. And I want to use this guy here to help me walk through the technosphere. The second piece of data is me. As a human, that's me right there. I'm part of the technosphere. You each are part of the technosphere. We're also part of the Earth. I am made, like you are, of carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, nitrogen, phosphorus, calcium, some copper and zinc too, I think. And so I'm a geological human as well as a technological human. And so making the connection with geology is that the technosphere is a new Earth system that's emerged in the last X number of years, whenever you draw the line at X, 100 years, millennia ago, fairly recently in geologic time. And as such, let me show on this slide the organization of the Earth, including the technosphere, at least the surface part of the Earth. It's arranged in layers. These layers include the atmosphere, the hydrosphere. This is all the water, the oceans, and what have you. The biosphere, the living matter spread out in a thin layer. And then I put the technosphere in here. Here's me, my euro, and you and your euros and all the other technological artifacts. And then there's the ground on which we stand, the lithosphere. These are geological systems, they're Earth systems. They function in a certain way, and as such, they have a certain kind of organization. And if we wanted to understand how they worked, we could try to look for specific rules that applied to each system. For example, the rules of fluid dynamics, that the discipline in physics applies to the atmosphere and hydrosphere. Now, the biosphere, neither the biosphere nor the technosphere has an overarching equation like the fluid dynamics that applies to the first two spheres. I think it was Kant that said that there will be no Newton of a blade of grass. There's no F equals ma, there's no Newton's law for biology, and there's no such law for the technosphere as well. But if we wanted to try to bring some regularity into our understanding of the technosphere or other complicated systems, we can do another thing suggested by Kant was rather than to look at the specific rules that apply to each one of these systems, those would be constitutive rules because they would depend on the constitution of the system, would be to look for a larger framework, some framing rules or some framing principles, that is regulative rules. And so let me just jump to several such rules that apply to really any sufficiently complicated dynamical system, but in particular talk about them in the context of the technosphere here. First is the rule of performance. The rule of performance applies to the parts of a system, and so I show me and my euro there as we're subject to the rule of performance. And the rule of performance says that we need to act most of the time in support of the system to which we belong, in support of the technosphere, or any other system to which we belong, to which we're a part. That's what a part is. A part of a system is a component that has some behavior that helps support the operation of the system. And that's kind of a key relation between parts and wholes that wouldn't hold for all the particles, all the components all of the time, but much of the time, otherwise there's not any system to talk about. So it's kind of a circular rule. But on the other hand, if you're part of the circle, then that can teach you something, and so that's the value of the rule of performance. Second rule here is the rule of provision. This applies to the system, and the first part of it has two parts. The first part of the rule of provision says that the system has to provide an environment that can suitably enable its parts to follow the rule of performance. The parts of a system have to be able to act in a way that supports the operation of the system, otherwise the system wouldn't be there to discuss. So it's the obligation of the system then to provide a situation that is conducive to the function of the parts in support of the system. So the technosphere provides very liberally for many people in the world, including most people, probably everybody in this audience. It provides food, energy, electricity, and so on, transportation, communication. Energy, very importantly, basically keeps us alive, most people. And without the technosphere, the human population would crash. So it's a very good provider. It is also an enforcer, the second part of the rule of provision. Why is everybody working for the technosphere? Well, you might not feel you're working for the technosphere, but the wheel on a car works for the car. The car provides a lubricated environment in the bearings, so it can turn in the suitably low friction way, and it's bolted onto the hub, onto the axle. It's part of the rule of provision. It's constrained to do what a wheel needs to do so that the car can function. Likewise, we're bolted in a less mechanical way into the technosphere. Rule of control says that a simple system cannot directly control a system that's much more complicated than itself, because such a system has many more degrees of freedom, many more avenues of operation, many more things it can do than the nominal controlling part, which is much simpler and does not have so many ways to actually counter the various multifarious ways in which the larger complicated system can act. So generally the simple system can't control one that's significantly more complex than itself. In particular, I can't control the technosphere. I'm a guest part of the HKV right now. I can't control the HKV, even though that is vastly smaller. I can't control my university, but I do perform there, and I'm performing here for the HKV. This is part of the rule of performance, what I'm doing. And the rule of provision makes it very easy for me to talk to you in a way where I'm visible and audible as part of the rule of provision, but I'm also kind of forced to stand here. Like I had a talk this morning and I'm a little bit tired. And I know they're selling beer right down there, so, I just see you later. But I don't do that. I won't do that because I'm actually, there's a spring that attaches me to this podium, and it's hard to go away. And it's not just me, it's you. You're part of HKV now, and it's hard for you to leave. You can leave if you want. But it's difficult for you to do it because there's all kinds of forces, most of them you don't think about. Oh, it's not worth it, I made an effort to come here. There's all kinds of rationalizations you can give. But basically, you're locked in by the technosphere. You're even locked into your seats that are oriented toward me. You can't sit in random directions. you're forced to sit in the direction that you can see me. All that makes sense. So this is nothing nefarious. It's all set up so that it works very well. But there's a certain amount of guiding and coercing and coaxing and incentivizing that goes on as well. And that happens in basically all the things we do in life. And then the fourth rule I want to talk about is the rule of reciprocity, which says that in a system, one part can affect another part directly, only if they're about the same size. So you can talk with your neighbor. You can push your neighbor. If they're sitting too close, you can push them away. Or you can pull them closer. But you can't interact directly with a HKV. What could you do? You go talk to the director. Well, you can talk to the director because he's your size. He's a person. But or my euro, I said I pick up the euro, but really it's interesting that it's my fingers that pick up the euro, not me. Because the euro is about the same size as my fingers. Okay, that's why the coin is that size, because it has to be, because of the rule of reciprocity, if we're supposed to pick it up, it kind of has to be finger size. So these are kind of general rules that apply to greater and lesser force to complex systems, including the Technosphere. And so let me give you an analogy. How much time do I have left, Bernie? I'm on a strict diet of time here, and I don't know. Plenty of time, okay, fine, thank you. So you go to the beach for vacation and you look at it, there's a wave. The wave is moving to the right toward the beach. And these are the molecules that make up the wave, water molecules. Water molecules are the wave. There's nothing else in the wave but the water molecules. And they obey all those four rules that I mentioned before. They obey the rule of performance. They're bouncing around like the thermal jiggling, that atoms do. And in doing this, they help move the momentum and the energy through the wave in the way that maintains the metabolism of the wave and the shape of the wave. So what you see as a wave is a result of all these molecules transmitting energy and momentum in an appropriate way. That's the rule of performance. And the rule of provision is that the wave makes it easy to do that. It has them all together, kind of holds them in the middle. But it kind of forces them to, they're right there where all this energy and momentum is coming off, and they just kind of naturally pick it up in their thermal motion and move it off somewhere else. They can't, if they wanted to be in a raindrop, I'd rather be in a raindrop and coming down like this rather than doing this in a wave. I'm tired of doing this, I'd rather be in a raindrop. No, you're in the wave, you do wave-like stuff. That's the other part of the rule of provision. You're basically coerced to do that. This molecule right here, that little one right there, he doesn't have much chance of controlling that wave. It's really more like the other way around, is that he goes along with the motion of the wave. So even though he helps to make up the wave, and every molecule helps to make up the wave, every molecule is also entrained by the wave and necessarily follows the motion of the wave. So where they thought they created the wave, well, they did create the wave, but also the wave is having a pretty large say in what they, how they move and so on in the future. And the rule of reciprocity, each molecule basically talks only with other molecules. It doesn't talk to the wave. It's too big. It doesn't know how to talk to it. And I also draw, and I'll come back to it later, this little cusp, this little curl on the tip of the wave, and I'm going to come back to that in my next slide. Let's see. I want to extend this analogy to the technosphere. So I say, well, the technosphere is kind of like a wave. It doesn't have that shape, but and here's me in my euro in the wave, somewhat confused by things. Part of that is jet lag, maybe being kind of upside down, but we move around in some complicated way within the technosphere. All these other dots are all of you and everybody else, plus my euro and this bottle and all other technological things in the world that are connected together, and that makes up the wave. And we follow the rule of performance, and as a result of that, the technosphere wave behaves doesn't wave up and down like a water wave, but it has certain motions and patterns and flows in it, and that's supported by all the parts following the rule of performance. And as we said before, it provides very well for most of, or at least many of its components. If it didn't, they would die. Or at least their lives would not be as good. There's great incentives to cooperate with the technosphere. It's very difficult to not cooperate with your local sector of the technosphere. I can't control it, however. My Euro can't control it. We're kind of along for the ride. Even though we worked very hard, it was our life's endeavor, it's very difficult to control it. You can't do it. And also, I interact with other people with this podium, but you don't interact directly with anything that's a lot bigger than you are. It doesn't mean you can't affect it, that you can't influence it. We're not just an isolated stratum sitting here with no connection, but it has to go through some kind of chain of overlapping sizes to affect much larger and much smaller scale. So that's kind of the situation that I would argue that we're in the technosphere. How much time do I have, Bernie? 4 minutes, okay. So so let me just summarize then. Here's where we are in the technosphere, just kind of in words for what I've said before. We work for the technosphere by the rule of performance, most of us. But generally, technosphere is not an option. It's very tough to drop out. Homeless people have somewhat dropped out. Migrants and refugees are out because their piece of the technosphere has kind of collapsed and doesn't provide the rule of provision anymore. So they're looking for some other spot to lodge. We're constrained. We're kind of forced or channeled by the technosphere. Although maybe it's an incentive. We like our job, so we work hard. But by various reasons, we end up working most of the time for some piece of the technosphere. Technosphere is not optional. You can't leave it, or you could become homeless. But even then, especially in a country like Germany, the technosphere comes and interacts with you, maybe put you on welfare or something. We're highly stratified. We can interact with other people and other things about our own size, but the rest of the world goes by too big to interact with directly or too small to interact with directly. Although indirectly we could have an effect. We lack control. Individually we lack control. And that little cusp on the wave, there, the technosphere is in some kind of trouble. There's serious environmental problems and other kind of problems that make us wonder about the stability of the system we're in. And so I put that little cusp on there as kind of a bit of a warning. And are we in a breaking wave? And if so, I'm finishing my last slide. Warned to keep on time. Those are all regulative comments. But now I say, well, what does this mean? What could we do? The answer is I don't know, but I'll give you an idea of what I'm thinking. What does this mean for us? Because we're really interested in our future. Many people think we can solve the problems of global change, sea level rise, loss of species, and so on, by technology. You put up a global shield to deflect some of the sunlight and dial the temperature down. We're going to have no more problem. Well, that's a technological fix. It might work for a time, but remember that another layer of technology is another layer of complexity. It's this vast complexity, among other things, that makes this very hard to control and to even understand what's going on. So I think in the long run, that maybe adds to the problems that we would have. We can't do it alone. I think we wouldn't argue about that. And we can work alone, we can contribute, but we can't solve the problem of instability or a breaking technosphere, if that is a problem. But what about doing it together? My last line on my last slide. What about doing it together? So €1 can't do anything. You can't even buy a cup of coffee, I found out. €1 billion would make a little more difference. €1 trillion, and the technosphere would begin to maybe turn its head a little bit, maybe notice that. One person doesn't have much collective effect, but what about 1 billion people? And what about 5 billion people, remembering that the population of the Earth is about 7 billion? Certainly collectively there ought to be some way that humans can get out of the dilemma they're in, and I think that's the obvious thing one would think of anyway. The only, and I put a question mark there because I think, as far as I can see, that is the only kind of valid track down which humanity as a whole might go, although it doesn't go down by itself. It goes down as always part of technology, so it's always somewhat compromised. But I just leave that with the cautionary note that if you have a very large mass of people who are organized around one thought, problems with the environment, for example, that begins to, to be organized, you have to have certain principles of organization. You have to have energy, you have to have food, you have to have security, you have to have transportation. In other words, you begin to look like a piece of the technosphere. And again, you see that the element of control begins to recede. So a very large environmental organization or movement. So the green movement is such a movement, okay, and the environmental movement is such a movement. But if it gets big enough, it has to have a significant technological component, and then all the four rules come back into play. But the people's hearts may have changed, their minds may have changed, their behavior may have changed in a more, say, ecological or climate or environmental friendly way as we think to ourselves. Whenever you have a large-scale effect coming from putting a bunch of small parts together, you don't really know what's going to emerge out of the top. There's many ways to organize a large movement in response to some stress, like environmental stress. It could be a rational scientific approach, like probably many people in Germany would favor. But historically, the movements which have mobilized the most people very strongly have been incredibly persistent, have been religious. And so in my country, there are certain religious movements which are actually moving away from climate control. But I think one can't discount, even in an age of reason and rationality, like probably many of us would think we're in, that is not the only solution to the problem, even if we all act together. That's always something sitting there as a possibility. And so I just leave with that thought. Working together is probably the only way out of this dilemma we're in, but the road is uncertain and it's really unclear where it will, or where we will end up at the end. Thank you.
So while those are starting up, thanks to everyone at the HKV for inviting me to this event and to the 100 Years of Now launch, which was quite an interesting and rich experience. I was told at the beginning of this that there'd be 6 screens, and I thought, well, I've never done that before, so I'll try using them, and slowly it was winnowed down to 5 and now 4 screens. So today I'm both presenting a kind of conventional set of slides to talk about sensing air pollution and creaturing data, which is a concept I'll unpack in a little bit, and also showing, just in a rather cursory way in the short time, some sensors, some air pollution sensors that I'll say a bit more about as we go through. So I don't know, is the tablet working? So I'll get started anyway. I'm sure that will come on in a minute. So if you should find yourself standing outside the Hobgoblin pub on New Cross Road in the borough of Lewisham, London, you might notice a grayish-white box approximately 2.5 meters high, scrawled with a faded line of graffiti. Wedged in the space between buildings and facing outward to the road, the air vent at the top of the monitoring equipment may be one of the few details that betrays the purpose of this structure, which is to measure air quality at this fixed spot in London. This is one of about 100 stations in the London Air Quality Network that covers the 33 boroughs of London, and it contributes to hourly indices as well as annual averages of the pollution episodes in London. So it detects sulfur dioxide, particulate matter 10 and 2.5, as well as nitrogen oxide and dioxide. And it generates data about whether the UK is meeting its EU air quality objectives. So if you're a passerby, you might notice this station in a rather fleeting way and have very little sense of the data it generates, which typically circulates in spaces of environmental science and policy. This air quality data is, in a way, black boxed and located in spaces remote from experience. And air quality data are not typically then present at a point of encounter with this monitoring station. Now, the King's Environment Research Group, which manages and runs this station, as well as most of the other stations in the network, has created an app so that you can look at the data in a rather generalized way to try to understand whether your air quality is good or poor. And this strategy moves the kind of experience of moving data from fixed sites and remote sites into something that you can then carry around and understand your air quality data. But at the same time, this is one spot, and so you receive data for this one spot of what air quality is in the city as a kind of a set of episodes, potentially, but you don't have an understanding of your individual exposure necessarily if you are standing a mile away from this station or walking along a busy street, and you might have a much different exposure to air pollution. So it's in this space of potential gaps in the data, as well as nuances in how people experience air quality and the different data that might be generated from those experiences, that a whole range of what are generally kind of now being called citizen sensing technologies have emerged. And I would identify these technologies as coming to the fore really now for over 10 years. Some of you may be familiar with projects such as Natalie Jarmanjenko's Feral Robotic Dogs. On the upper right-hand corner, things like Beatriz da Costa's Pigeon blog. These are monitoring air pollution. Some of these projects then solidifying into things that are much more like products with the air quality egg. And these are, I think, some of the initial creatures of air quality data in a more sort of literal sense of creatures that are meant to give you a sense of your individual air quality experience so that you can gather your own data about air quality. And many of these projects are then trying to fill a gap in your individual experience, or in some cases they're also challenging governmental data and suggesting that governmental data is either insufficient in its coverage or potentially it's even inaccurate in what it's documenting. So whether displaying pollution levels or developing platforms to make data more readily available, you could argue that air quality is really presented as an informational problem. That if you gather more data and you better understand the condition of air quality, you can address it in some way through environmental politics and action. And citizen sensing is also a way to move practices of monitoring pollution from an expert arena into a more distributed and democratic arena. And so this is where citizen sensing could be seen to be located. At the same time, you have environmental regulators such as the US Environmental Protection Agency suggesting that different types of uses then come along with these different ways of gathering data. So this is also part of the kit that I have here today to sort of demonstrate that it's not simply a matter then of taking a gadget and putting it out into an environment and suddenly having data, ta-da, as though that is just a kind of instantly kind of cooked thing that you'll have access to. What I would suggest, and as obviously many science and technology scholars have also articulated, is that data are intertwined with practices, responses to perceived problems, modes of materializing and evidencing problems, and anticipations of political engagement and how to actually enter into a political arena and have effect. So how do these differing practices of environmental monitoring inform our environmental politics and the possible trajectories we might undertake with data? What are the instruments, relations, and experiences of air quality as we experience it through collecting data? And how do environments become computational problems that we would address through these monitoring technologies? So this is something that I address also in a forthcoming book, Program Earth, that's coming out February 2016. But just to briefly say that I examine here in this talk today and also in this book the question of how computational sensing technologies generate milieux, relations, entities, occasions, and interpretive registers of sensing, so that the becoming environmental of computation describes this kind of process of sensor-based engagements with environments. So this isn't just a matter of detecting an external problem, I would say, of gathering data about air pollution, but it's about generating the subjects and the environments and the infrastructures where that data makes sense, whether it's as scientific facts or matters of concern. And this is what I'm calling then the kind of creaturing of data. Here working with Alfred North Whitehead, philosopher and mathematician, when he says that the actual world is a process, and this process is the becoming of actual entities. And these actual entities might be termed actual occasions or creatures, which are the lively meetings of entities that form roots of experience. So I'm suggesting we think of data as a root of experience. These are all roots of experience. And that as we gather data, we're not just documenting static facts of air quality in any given time or place, but we're generating practices, entities, modes of participation, as well as particular environments and ways of engaging with those environments. So this is what I call creaturing data, thinking of data in registers other than universal, abstract kind of conditions of data that might seem to be the spaces of scientific legitimacy, and that we might think about creaturing data as something that could even be a resource when thinking about citizen sensing. So just to kind of then make a quick interlude into talking about this first technology very briefly, this is a Grove Seed Studio board measuring particulate matter 2.5 with a Shinyai sensor, if you can see this here. And it's just basically running some Arduino code, which is how I'm able to type in creaturing PM. And its unit here is not measuring PM 2.5 in a unit that would be considered scientifically legitimate as such, because the way the device works, it has an optical counter, it's infrared, and it's simply counting the particles in the chamber. Now that doesn't have a kind of machine learning or smoothing algorithm. It doesn't have any sort of input here that's taking the particles in the chamber and then using those in such a way that it might make sense against a standard reading of particulate matter, which would be micrograms per cubic meter. And I'll say a bit more about that in relation to some of the other technologies. Here what we have is a kind of makerly way of thinking about what an air pollution device might be. And it's been interesting through the Citizen Sense project, which one of the remits of the project was to test many of these technologies, these seemingly off-the-shelf technologies, and see what sort of data they generate. And finding that much of the data generated through devices such as these is not necessarily in the usual scientific units that you would use to understand air quality. So you're not able to necessarily make a comparison between what that particulate matter reading is and a reading that would be in the EU air quality objectives, which is, by the way, 25 micrograms per cubic meter on an average basis, on an annual average basis. So there's the other kind of issue of temporality here, which is that you have a reading that is in the moment, but you would need to understand how that averages over the course of an entire year to understand your exposure. So that's the Grove Air Monitor, and that's one of the first technologies we worked with, which we did a very quick build, and we took it for a walk in South London, where there is a fair amount of air pollution, although the air quality monitors are quite sporadic there, and only one of them measures 2.5, the one that I showed you. So I think here's a kind of interesting way in which to think about creaturing air quality data. What would you need to do with this device in order to have it have more sustained relevance in relation to air quality and air pollution? So I don't really have time today to talk about air pollution as a larger issue, but suffice it to say, if you're not familiar with it already, PM 2.5 is one of the many air pollutants of concern that leads to issues with cardiac, pulmonary, and respiratory disease, and is of increasing concern, although only really recently monitored PM 2.5. PM 10 has a longer history of being monitored, and of course things like sulfur dioxide, and even longer history because of coal and so on, which you might be familiar with here, given the previous levels of coal burning. So here's where, again, this issue of how to deal with gaps in the data have informed the development of devices such as these. So the second device I have here is the AirBeam, which originally is kind of developed out of the air casting monitor, so it's a similar technology. And this was actually purchased off Kickstarter. And so I've taken this out for a walk, actually up to the HKV from the hotel and back. And you can see it gives you PM 2.5 readings. These are actually in micrograms per cubic meter. And you can see there's a little what you would be called a pollution hotspot potentially over by the Brandenburg Gate, where there was a peak PM moment of 245. So if that were sustained over a course of a year, that would be 10 times the EU kind of limits of 25 micrograms per cubic meter. But by and large, on the walks that I've gone on around here, I can show you quickly the walk up through the park. And this is the display where it has PM 2.5, humidity and temperature, as well as sound levels. Let's take this over here. And here you can see walking up through the park, if the map loads, is a relatively PM non-intensive experience. And you can also, might as well run this in the real time, have this running now. See what the air is in here. You can watch that. So one of the things that I think these monitors raise is the question of relevance. And that's something I would say we've tested much more intensively with the SPEC air quality monitor, which is also measuring PM 2.5. This is one of the technologies within the larger citizen sensing kit that we deployed in northeastern Pennsylvania in order to understand fracking and possible pollution coming from industry there. So we had a kit of basically a frac box, the SPEC, some logs, a platform, as well as badges for about 30 participants to use over the course of, it ended up being 9 months in the end. And so the SPEC was one of the devices that was most kind of easy for people to use in terms of looking at their PM 2.5 exposure. But at the same time, a recurring question was, what do I do with this data? I might be told that I am experiencing levels that are unhealthy for sensitive groups, and many people living in these environments do have respiratory and other problems, but really not sure how to then take that data and make claims with it. Several participants did actually go to environmental regulators and Department of Health and indicate that they were receiving quite high levels and that something should be done. And then we engaged in a series of conversations with residents and regulators about what would need to be done in order for this data to be taken seriously. So I think there are interesting questions here, and this comes up in some of the EPA reports as well, about how types of data and types of uses are interlinked. And data might need to follow very particular protocols of collection and so on, and particular kinds of instruments to be used in order for it to be admissible within regulatory spaces or within scientific spaces. But there may be instances where data are just good enough for being political agents or provocations for making claims about industrial effects and so on. But I think this remains a relatively open question as to how these then citizen sensing technologies might be creatured and the kinds of actions and environments of relevance that would be created along with these technologies in order for them to have effect. So I guess what I'm saying is it's not simply a matter of collecting data and then going out and making claims with it. It's also a matter of thinking about the practices, the actors, the environments of relevance that might need to be created along with these devices in order for them to have effect and make change. Of course, you could kind of easily say that these sensors are constructing a problem of air quality in very particular ways. But the data gathering practices might also be seen to be ways of tuning environments, subjects, and experiences, and of bringing worlds into being. So these are ways in which creatures and facts kind of participate in worlds. So a process of creaturing data then attends to the ways in which data are not fixed objects gathered through universal criteria, but instead are entities which form through practices and emerge as creaturely processes. And as discussed here then, they might also be seen as roots of experience, as ways of feeling the world, as ways of feeling environments. And this is a way of kind of taking up the datum, as Whitehead would say, as a particular way of experiencing or feeling the datum. So if we consider the data that digital sensors generate, then these might be considered less as technologies for gathering data and more as technologies for processing, transforming, and creaturing data, and that these are particular ways of having engagements with environments. Why is this important? Because on a concrete level, in order for citizen-generated data to be taken seriously and inform environmental policy and politics, it is necessary to consider all of these infrastructures, environments, and practices that are bound up with creaturing data in order to understand how citizen-generating data, among other forms of data, might become relevant and affect change. So this requires tuning our experiences to the modes of experience that count and for what purpose, and how other kinds of experiences might also begin to count, and how data then are a part of those practices. So what it means to sense in this context is not merely a matter of obtaining a result, which is the usual way in which citizen sensing is framed, but rather it's a way of thinking about these extended social environments. So in that respect, I'd like to end with a quote from Whitehead, where he's here referencing William James in a sense. But he says, "We find ourselves in a buzzing world amid a democracy of fellow creatures, whereas under some disguise or other, orthodox philosophy can only introduce us to solitary substances, each enjoying an illusory experience." So here I think this is quite an interesting quotation for thinking about how creatures form democracies and how we might think about our shared experiences of air, pollution, and possibilities for engagement, which might bring us into inventive modes of solidarity. Thanks.
Okay, I also want to thank the organizers here at the HKV for inviting me. And yeah, I'm also, like Peter, a little bit tired from a long day and a long couple of 3 days. However, I am excited to, I guess, get through my paper and start to talk with Peter and Jennifer, and hopefully with some of you in the audience. And in fact, I start off with Whitehead, and I guess they'll bring up my datum. I've written a book about Whitehead recently, and I want to just say something very briefly about my argument as a kind of context for considering this artwork, which is my datum, and I'll explain that in a little bit. So Jennifer's just talked a little bit about Whitehead, and I would put my finger on a very similar moment in Whitehead, which is the process of genesis of actual entities, or concrescence, as he puts it. And he makes the claim, the seemingly astonishing claim, that every actual entity is in relationship with every other actual entity in the settled world at the moment of its emergence, or its concrescence, or its genesis. Right? So he posits a kind of world of solidarity of actual entities, which I would agree with Jennifer is a sensory world, and I'll say something about that in a little minute. So this concept of Whitehead's has important implications for perception and its limits. And Whitehead himself develops some of these consequences in his extension of the concept of perception and of sense perception. He argues that Western philosophy before him has worked with a very, or maybe before James, has worked with a very impoverished notion of sense perception, which hypothesizes the final moment in a causal lineage that's much more complicated. So namely the moment when here I am looking at you and I see you in this picture in my brain, which is my sense perception in the presentational immediacy, as he puts it. And he says that that this is essentially how philosophers before him or before James have understood perception. And what this leaves out is another dimension of perception that he calls perception in the mode of causal efficacy, which he most of the time explains as a kind of bodily perception, the fact that we have inklings of this mode of perception when, say, our eyes are tired and we realize that we actually see with the organ of our eyes. But I think it goes well beyond that. It goes through the entire set of bodily processes that are involved in the genesis of a sense perception, but also the environmental processes that stand behind those bodily processes, or in which those bodily processes are implicated. And in my work, just to say something very briefly, I'm very moved by Whitehead's expansion of perception, but I also think that it's limited in the sense that he keeps it limited to human activity, right? And so he talks about the coordination of these two modes of perception in what he calls symbolic reference, and he says this is typical of human agency, human life, human activity. And what I argue in my book is that we are now living in a world, and maybe have always lived in a world, where there's a kind of sensibility that evades capture by human sense organs and processes of processing of sensations into perceptions, and that this domain of sensibility, which I call worldly sensibility, is a domain that first of all is happening at a level right beneath our perception, and also at a speed that is too rapid for us to be present to, right, in the dream of phenomenology, that you would be present to the constitution of your own consciousness. And I argue that data, right, of the kind even that Jennifer has just shown us, right, but I'd say biometric data, environmental data of all sorts, gives us a sort of surrogate mode of accessing this domain of sensibility, and then of presentifying it to consciousness, right? So it takes the place of this coordination that Whitehead speaks of between causal efficacy and presentational immediacy. And this is the concept of feed forward, right? So the idea that data is gathered about a moment of sensation in which humans are, I as a human, embodied human, am implicated, but without awareness of it, and it feeds it forward, it presentifies it to me in a later moment, right? So the argument is that humans and human consciousness are always too late on the scene, right? And that we need data to clue us in to what's already happened to us, right? Okay, so I want to link this to another dimension of Whitehead's concept of solidarity, which is the role of vibrations, right, or the vibratory continuum, which is how he understands the sort of basic principle of solidarity of the universe. And remember, he was a scientist and a mathematician, so it makes sense, I suppose, that he would think in these terms. And I have a fairly long quote from Process and Reality I'll read. He says, "The atom is only explicable as a society with activities involving rhythms with their definite periods. Again, the concept shifted its application. Protons and electrons were conceived as materialistic," oops, sorry. What happened? Protons and electrons were conceived. Where am I? Yeah, okay, sorry. Protons and electrons were conceived as materialistic electric charges whose activities could be construed as locomotive adventures. We are now approaching the limits of any reasonable certainty in our scientific knowledge, but again there is evidence that the concept may be mistaken. The mysterious quanta of energy have made their appearance, derived, as it would seem, from the recesses of protons or of electrons. Still worse for the concept, these quanta seem to dissolve into vibrations of light. Also, the material of the stars seems to be wasting itself in the production of the vibrations. Further, the quanta of energy are associated by a simple law with the periodic rhythms which we detect in the molecules. Thus, the quanta are themselves, in their own nature, somehow vibratory, but they emanate from the protons and electrons. Thus, there is every reason to believe that rhythmic periods cannot be dissociated from protonic and electronic entities. Okay, so this idea of a kind of solidarity, right, in which every actuality is in relation with every other actuality at the moment of its arisal, and whose basic property, I suppose, is a kind of rhythmic resonance. Okay, so now I want to turn to this artwork, which is Ralph Becker's Mirage from 2014, and Ralph actually is here in the audience somewhere, so I'm a little bit embarrassed because there's not a whole lot of information about this work, and I may say something completely wrong, in which case, please don't say anything, Ralph. We'll talk about it later. Okay, so this is my datum, and it is a complex artwork that I understand to be a sort of mixing board that operates passages and transformations across disparate events and levels of phenomena. So the first level, and I'm going to talk about 4 levels. The first level is the registration of data concerning the geomagnetic field of the Earth using a flux gate magnetometer, right? And you can see the This is the flux gate magnetometer, and there's the data, right? So it's gathering information about something, electromagnetic properties of the Earth that certainly human perceivers have absolutely no access to, right? A flux gate magnetometer is a device that measures the intensity and orientation of magnetic lines of flux. The central element of the flux gate magnetometer is a ferromagnetic core surrounded by 2 coils of wire in a configuration resembling a transformer. Alternating current is passed through one coil, called the primary, producing an alternating magnetic field that induces alternating current in the other coil, called the secondary. The intensity and phase of the alternating current in the secondary are constantly measured. When a change occurs in the external magnetic field, the output of the secondary coil changes. The extent and phase of this change can be analyzed to determine the intensity and orientation of the flux lines. Okay, so the second level. This data that's gathered by the flux gate magnetometer is then fed into an unsupervised or deep learning algorithm modeled on the work of Jeff Hinton, who is a scientist at Google, whose work focuses on improving methods of searching large databases. Hinton has pioneered research on unsupervised learning for database searching. In response to the contemporary advent of massive-scale databases, Hinton and his colleagues have taken a new approach to data search and analysis, or rather, they've recurred to an old research method and made it newly relevant. As opposed to traditional models of search that operate with pre-given labels and seek to identify targets based on their match with such labels, deep learning, or unsupervised learning, discovers the intricate structure in large data sets by using the backpropagation algorithm to indicate how a machine should change its internal parameters that are used to compile the representation in each layer from the representation in the previous layer. Okay, so the machine itself adjusts its own internal properties in relation to the relation between a new datum and a just passed datum, right? And this is also very Whiteheadian. So Becker's work complicates this process of backpropagation by multiplying the variations of the data, or as he puts it in his own description of the work, quote, the algorithm dreams variations of the previously analyzed signal. Becker gets this idea from Hinton, who developed a so-called Helmholtz machine, a machine that deploys a wake-sleep algorithm to consolidate its artificial neural network. During the wake phase, the network takes in new information and is trained by its sensory input. During the sleep phase, the sensory input is cut off, and the algorithm backpropagates the network with random patterns. Okay, third level, these variations that are produced during the sleep cycle, when the input is cut off, are translated into a two-dimensional matrix that physically transforms a thin mirror sheet using 45 muscle wire actors. And you see that here. The changes produced in the mirror sheet are analogous to the changes in the system state. And finally, a fourth level, a thin laser line, which is this, and this is supposed to be a video, no? I thought so, maybe not. Thin laser line is beamed onto the mirror surface from an acute angle. It generates a depth projection on the wall, which constantly shifts as the signal changes, creating the impression of a subliminal wandering, quote, subliminal wandering through a landscape, again, in Becker's description. Okay? Okay, so this is my datum, and why is it important to me? What's at stake here? What's at stake in this work that via a series of indirections places human sense perception into contact with the electromagnetic radiation that, for Whitehead, expresses the basic vibrational continuum of the cosmos. Right? So I want to pick up maybe on some of the things I said earlier. I want to argue that this work helps us, this work thematizes a process of mediation, a series of mediations, indirect mediations, that really outlines a different vocation for media than the one that we have traditionally typically worked with, namely media as a technology of inscription and storage of information that can be consumed by humans or by others elsewhere and else when, right? What's at stake here, I think, is a concept of media as a transmission-oriented concept, where media really disappear into an infrastructural role, and, as I would put it, can only be fed forward into human experience, right? So the relationship between the original data of the magnetic field, the way in which it gets processed through this deep learning algorithm or unsupervised algorithm, these are all infrastructural in relation to human experience because we have no access to them, right? And they can only be presentified to us, or the data that they're processing can only be presentified to us after the fact, right, in a further moment of consciousness. So I would argue that Becker's work is a specific implementation of a feed-forward circuit. By deploying a sensor that senses a domain of worldly sensibility itself outside the range of any possible human sense experience, the work makes clear, at least to me, that what is at issue here is not something that can be channeled exclusively through the human perspective. Then, by transforming the data from the sensing using protocols developed for large-scale database searching, Becker introduces yet another distantiation from the human perspective, this time one that is intimately connected to practical processes that have concrete material effects for human experience, even as they elude capture or presentification by human perception. Right? So maybe to put it in a more summary way, where inscriptive media precipitate phenomena onto surfaces, transmissional media transduce electromagnetic signals, right? And what makes Becker's work an aesthetic mediation of this is the way in which he gives us a sensory connection via this video, which is not a video, this projection of the data, right? Of the doubly transformed, or let's say triply transformed data into something that can be perceived by humans, and that is perceived by humans in an aesthetic mode, right? So again, it takes data from the electromagnetic field of the Earth, treats it as if it were a big data database using the latest approaches to analysis of data in order to produce a visual and physical interface that allows human perceivers some certainly indirect or maybe triply indirect contact to the vibrational continuum that lies at the heart of what I've called worldly sensibility. So people have, writing about this, and there's not much written about it, have focused on the way in which Becker's work actually makes physical and tangible the processes of computation that are involved in this circuit, and I would certainly agree that that's the case. Right, so there's a kind of laying bare of the mechanism or mechanisms, right, and perhaps that's even a laying bare of the mechanism of this form of data searching that seems so far away from any access by us. But I would also argue that the work itself is an example of a feed-forward circuit that serves as a complex mediator between the human and the world, or of human-world contact or human implication in the world in a mode that is neither limited to or accessible to human perceptual experience, and that is not channeled through the human perspective, right? So I think I'll stop right there and invite Jennifer and Peter to come up and join me here and maybe engage in a talk.